So we're in 1935 in Germany. I discussed yesterday the publication of Heschel's book on the biography of Maimonides. But in 1935 was a very important year in the history of the German Jewish community, because that was the year that the Reichstag enacted the Nuremberg Laws. And one of the provisions of the Nuremberg Laws was that Jews in Germany not only were all fired from the civil service, not only were all Jewish lawyers automatically disbarred, not only all Jewish physicians could only now treat other Jews, they were not allowed to treat Aryans, but Jews were no longer considered German citizens. And the shock of this to the average German Jew was incredibly immense. I mean, it's just difficult for us to imagine it. Imagine if the government, the Congress, of course, they never do anything, so you don't have to worry. But suppose they made a law that, all people of such ethnic origin lose their citizenship. What would people who were part of that group feel? Or we do have a historical precedent in terms of the Japanese during the Second World War, who lost most of their rights of citizens and were put in concentration camps by one of our most liberal presidents and by the governor of California, who was later our probably most liberal Supreme Court Justice, Earl Warren. So imagine the identity crisis that this caused amongst German Jews, who view themselves as well-integrated Germans, often German first and second. And this gradually, predictably, caused a tremendous resurgence of interest amongst Jews in their heritage. And a tremendous resurgence of adult Jewish education in Germany at that time, because people were trying to find what is this Jewish identity that they had surrendered. And so Jewish education, adult Jewish education, became a major, very personal issue for Jews in Germany after the adoption of the Nuremberg Laws in 1935. Now, as it happened, in 1935, Heshcel was working part-time for his publisher, German publisher, Erich Ries, who published the Maimonides book, as an editor. But it was a very part-time job. But he was living sort of day-to-day, still the effects of the Great Depression in Germany. He was living in a rented room in people's houses in Berlin. Food was not plentiful, eating potatoes all day, as he used to tell me. Potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. One suit, And at that time, he had already met, as I mentioned to you yesterday, Martin Buber. And Buber was being hounded by the Gestapo, and Buber was preparing to move to Jerusalem to get out of Germany. And Heschel was trying to convince Buber to schlep him along with him to Jerusalem and get him a job there. And Buber didn't want to do it. But Buber had other plans for him. Meanwhile, I'll tell you what they were in a second. Meanwhile, Heshcel was tutoring Buber in Hebrew. Buber knew many languages. I don't know if you know this, but one of the first books that Buber published was his translation into German of the classic in Chinese religion, the I Ching. Buber knew Chinese very well, and he apparently knew many other languages very well, because Heshcel told me he once went to see him. That's when he went to see him and looked through his library and figured out he didn't have a Mishnah. He was looking through his library. What was Buber doing at the same time? Buber was in the other room checking the galley proofs, the page proofs of a translation of his book, Ayin Thou, into Spanish. So he apparently knew Spanish, and very, very few people in Germany in those days. I mean, a lot of people knew French. Some people knew a little Russian, but nobody knew Spanish. So Buber even knew Spanish. But Hebrew he didn't know too well. I mean, he knew classical Hebrew. He knew rabbinic Hebrew. He knew Midrashic Hebrew. He knew Hasidic Hebrew. But he didn't know modern Hebrew. He didn't know speaking Hebrew, and here he was going to Jerusalem. And Heshcel tutored him along. Buber's plan for Heshcel was for Heshcel to take over for him, for Buber, when Buber left Frankfurt in 1936 as the director of the school that was founded by Franz Rosenzweig in the 1920s for adult Jewish education, namely the Lehrhaus. And because it was in the middle of this time, right after the Nuremberg Laws, that there was this tremendous resurgence of Jewish interest in Judaism. And Rosenzweig, in his founding speech of the Lehrhaus, defined the purpose of the Lehrhaus as being an institution to take Jews, as he put it, from the periphery to the center. To move that the Jews in Germany were at the periphery of Judaism. And therefore, the purpose of the adult Jewish education was to take Jews who were at the periphery, who were very educated in Western culture, but move them in toward the center of Judaism, which they never really got to. And, of course, Heshcel was beginning in the opposite place. He was moving from the center to the periphery rather than from the periphery to the center. So after Buber left to go to Jerusalem, to the Hebrew University, Heshcel became the head of the Lehrhaus. And so he was right in the middle of all the action of adult Jewish education in Germany at this extraordinarily critical period in sort of the last chapter of German Jewry. Now I've discussed with, we have this thing now, hypothetical history, the what if thing, what if history had gone this way or that. I've discussed with many people, and it was brought up to me first by people, German Jews, who came from there then. What if Hitler had, as many people predicted, had just been a whim and went out of power suddenly? What if Nazism had ended then, in the 30s? Would there have been the greatest renaissance in the history of Jewish thinking ever? Probably yes. Because you had a lot of brain power in the German Jewish community at that time. Think of all the great scientists and artists, artistic people who came out of there. So we'll never know. But they began to have they had the beginning of a renaissance. But then, of course, what happened, you all know. So it never really went where it could have gone. Please.
Rebecca.
I know.
I think I know that the Jews in Germany at that time were relatively, what I want to say, that's where Reform Judaism was born. I mean, they were by and large they were more conservative or not, kind of the opposite of Hasidism. You know what I mean? Weren't they very rational and completely different than what Heshcel would have been used to from his background?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I don't want to call them reform because what reform means in this country was not what reform meant in Germany then. They were liberal, which in those days was probably closer to what here would be centrist conservative Judaism than what in this country became Reform Judaism. Because there were two wings of Reform Judaism in Germany in the 19th century, and that was the more conservative wing, which was the dominant one, the more, I don't want to say traditional, but the more conservative wing of the Reform movement, and the more radical, what they call the radical wing. And the radical wing took root here in America. It did not take root in Germany. I was just down in the library. I noticed they have this new book in about one of the early radical reform synagogues here in Chicago, which is still in existence, the Sinai congregation. And it's called Sundays at Sinai, because until today they still celebrate Shabbat there on Sunday. So this was the old radical reform, which is still found in certain remote places in the United States. But if you go, for example, to one of the oldest congregations in the United States, in Savannah, they still follow this liturgy of Sinai congregation in Chicago. You go down to Savannah, you go into the synagogue there, which was around Washington. You see the letter Washington sent them after the Revolution, the whole business. And you pick up the prayer book in the pews in the sanctuary, and it says, liturgy used by Chicago Sinai congregation, which nobody else uses hardly in this country, which is still the old radical Reform synagogue. So
there's a movement in Reform now for those who think Reform got too traditional, and I think it's called the Society for the Revitalizing Classical Reform. I think it's called. Sounds like headquartered at Sinai or something.
well, probably. Oh, they just had a big scandal there because the rabbi got caught. He's a compulsory gambler. Got caught, sent to jail or something. So they're in the middle of an appeal. I don't know if he got caught on Shabbos, but he didn't have to work on Shabbos. It's a very strange place. The former rabbi used to give sermons in favor of intermarriage and anti-Israel sermons. It was a very strange place. And that was the radical reform. But that's not the reform that was in Germany at that time. So Heshcel was commuting then between Berlin and Frankfurt to run the Lehrhaus. And he started to work on a little monograph, which he eventually worked into a little book. It's a very little book. It's only about 40 pages of German. For the 500th anniversary of the birth of one of the leading figures in the history of Spanish Jewry, and that was done Yitzhak Abarbanel. See, if you want to write articles and get them published, you used to look for anniversaries, and you knew there'd be a market for it. Somebody would publish it. So he, I guess, was looking for anniversaries, and 1437 was the birth of Don Isaac Abarbanel. So 1937 would be a good time to publish an article about him. And Heshcel started writing this monograph about Don Isaac Abarbanel. The German version of this monograph is very rare. And I hardly know, even amongst Heshcel experts, I hardly know anybody who's ever read it or seen it before. I have a copy, original copy. Now, do any of you know anything about Don Isaac Abarbanel? Besides that he was born in 1437.
He went to Rome, and he started a mystical movement there?
No, that's Abulafi.
Okay,
You're a few centuries off.
okay.
Abulafi is 13th century.
I do that.
It's a nice, mellifluous Sephardic name, so don't get them mixed up. They're very different kind of guys. Very different guys.
So you leading rabbi in Amsterdam and wrote...
No. He didn't get to Amsterdam. You're thinking of when I should have been Israel, I think.
Do we get a prize if we get it right?
I could probably come up with it. I can't come up with this place with a cup of coffee after 2 o'clock, but I could probably come up with a prize. I'm always interested to see what people know.
He came out of Spain, right?
He came out of Spain. I thought somebody would mention that there's a kosher Passover wine named after him. Until today, they still have conventions with the Byron L family. There are different spellings of the name, but they're still around. And there is a wine, but that's not why Heschel wrote this little monograph. Well, he was the leader of the Jewish community in Spain at a very inopportune time, namely the time of the expulsion in 1492. He was also the financial and political advisor to Ferdinand and Isabella. And when they expelled the Jews from Spain, he was given a dispensation by the king and queen to stay and remain a Jew if he would continue to work for them as their financial counselor, which he declined. And he went into exile with the Jews of Spain, and he went to Naples. Now, he wrote a very important and extremely lengthy commentary to the Bible, which is unlike any other Hebrew commentary to the Bible, because rather than simply comment on the text, he begins by raising all the questions that you have with all the problems you have with the text, whatever it is. He raises all the questions. Then he shows you how all the previous commentators tried to answer those questions. Then he tries to show you why they were all wrong. And then what the correct answer is, which happens to be his. It's a very unusual and brilliant and well-written commentary to the entire Bible. I don't think it's ever been translated. He also wrote a trilogy, 3-volume work, on the idea of the Messiah in Judaism, because after the expulsion from Spain, there was a tremendous upsurge of messianic expectation. And the idea of the Messiah became a very central idea, especially in the generation of the exiles. This led him to a big problem. And the big problem had to do with the fact that he was a guy who was a very astute, what we call today, political scientist. And he had been in government in Spain. He was probably the most powerful Jewish figure, statesman, until Henry Kissinger. If you want to consider Henry Kissinger a statesman. But he was tremendously powerful and tremendously influential, which is shown by the fact that even though he was a Jew living at the time of the expulsion, they gave him the title Don Isaac of Abravanel. That didn't mean he was a mafia Don, it meant he was like a nobleman. His father was also a leader in the Jewish community in Spain, did convert. Judah he had a son who he named after his father, after the father died, whose name was also Judah Abarbanel, and who's known to the world, you don't know his name is Judah Abarbanel, by his Italian name, which is Leon Hebreo, which simply means Leon the Jew. Leon Hebreo. Does that ring any bells? Leon Hebreo wrote a book in Italian. It's probably the only classic of Jewish literature written in Italian in the 16th century, called Dialoghi d'Amore, Dialogues on Love. And if you ever, any of you ever read Don Quixote by Cervantes, who now scholars believe was a Jew, was a converso, you'll find that he is mentioned in the introduction to Don Quixote, where Cervantes says, if you want to understand love, read Leon Hebreo's Dialoghi d'Amore. So he was one of the most famous writers in Italy in the 16th century, but get back to Don Yitzhak about Heshcel. Unfortunately, he was considered a convert. He was often considered an apostate that he converted to Catholicism. He had the same name as his grandfather, and his grandfather converted, but he never converted. But in some of the Hebrew versions of his book, Yikuach al-Ha'ahava, it's called in Hebrew, he is called Yehuda Abarbanel the apostate. But he was never an apostate. It was his grandfather with the same name. It's quite dangerous to put the names of his grandfather. Anyway, Don Isaac Abarbanel, as I mentioned, wrote this trilogy on the Messianic Age because they expected the Messianic Age might start a generation or two after the expulsion, because there was a tradition that you have what is called the birth pangs of the Messiah before the Messiah comes, hard times, as a prelude to the final redemption. But Abarbanel noticed a very strange thing, and he never resolved this problem. The guy who was, talking about all the problems in the Bible and trying to resolve them, this is a problem he could never resolve in his books on the Messianic idea. He pointed out that in all Jewish traditions, the Messiah, the Messianic kingdom, is what kind of political structure? A kingdom. The Messiah is always a king, because the Messiah is, the comeback of King David. But after he came to Naples, which was a republic, he came to the conclusion that republican form of government was the best form, was the ideal form. He was the first person in Jewish thought, in Jewish political thought, to come up with this idea, namely that the monarchy is not the best form of government. First person ever in the history of Judaism to come up with that idea. The first one to be for a republican, which is our form of government.
That's Don Isaac or later?
Don Isaac. First one, based on his own experience of serving a king and a queen. I mean, he was not simply talking theoretically. So his problem was, how do you reconcile your conviction, namely that the republican form of government is the best form, with the tradition in your 3 books on Messianism about the Messiah, who traditionally is always the king. Anyway, so Heshcel wrote this book on Don Isaac Abarbanel. And as I said, most people, even who know Heshchel's work very well, never read it. But it seems to me it's a very critical part of the story, or as people would say today, of the narrative, a word I don't really like. of Heschel's life and work and ideas. Why? Because here he is in Germany in the 1930s, right after the Nuremberg Laws, dealing with the whole issue of German Jewish identity in a setting of adult Jewish education in the Lehrhaus, in a community that's struggling with its own identity. And what's he writing about?
Expulsion.
The same thing. In other words, here you have the Spanish Jewish community in Spain for over 1,000 years. Maimonides, when he left, says in his book, in his monograph, Igeret Hashma, the letter on apostasy, he says, our family has been in Spain since the destruction of the temple, since they left after the destruction of the temple. Well, that was in the year 70. So if there were Jews in Spain already in the year 70 or the year 100, and they're leaving in the end of the 1400s, it's almost 1500s, 1400 years, they've been there a very long time, and all of a sudden they're being told, this isn't your land anymore. You don't belong here. So Heschel writes about Abarbanel and is telling the story about Abarbanel. It's the story of the people right in front of him. Not his story, but the story of the people right in front of him. And then he has a very, very bizarre statement at the end of the book, where he talks about, was there anything good that came out of the Spanish expulsion? And he says, well, what happened after the expulsion? He said the Spaniards went over to the Americas, which they discovered, and they killed everybody. And if the Jews hadn't been expelled from Spain, they would have been amongst the conquistadors. Mm-hmm. And they would have been involved in this genocide. He didn't have the word genocide yet, it wasn't invented yet, but they would have been involved in this mass extinction of the peoples of the Americas. So the fact that the Jews were exiled from Spain saved them from being mass murderers. And so there was a kind of hidden, secret benefit to the fact that the Jews were expelled from Spain.
But they were killed in the Southwest by the Spanish.
Yes, and a lot of the conquistadors were conversos, but he didn't know any of that, of course. But the point he's trying to make is, I mean, and of course he had no idea of what was coming in Germany in terms of the Holocaust per se, and the death camps and all that. All he was dealing with then was the Nuremberg Laws and Hitler becoming more and more powerful, and trying to speculate, well, maybe there's something, redemptive, hidden in this whole thing. And my guess is what he had in mind were two things. One was that maybe out of all of this is going to come the renaissance of German Jewry, which he saw happening right in front of him in his classes at the Lehrhaus. And the second was, as a person who lived as a child through World War I, and he saw what happened during World War I, and he knew German Jews who had been serving in the German army in World War I, who might have been involved in some of the gassings and other atrocities of World War I, that if the Jews were no longer allowed in the German army, after the Nuremberg Laws, maybe, they won't be, if there's a war, maybe they won't be able to be involved in these crimes against humanity. So I don't know what was going through his mind, but I find it rather intriguing that at the end of his little monograph on Abarbanel, he hints not only to the comparison between the situation of the Spanish Jews in the 1490s and the German Jews in the 1930s, but also hints to the possibility that there was that in catastrophe, which is a very Kabbalistic idea, that hidden in catastrophe is always something redemptive. It's a very, very Hasidic idea, by the way. Very much part of the thinking of the Baal Shem Tov. And what that might be, he's saying we don't know. Just as Byron L didn't know when he left Spain in 1492. So I wanted to mention that because hardly anybody knows about this. So Heshcel is teaching in Frankfurt, 1937, publishes the monograph on Byron L. And in October 1938, everything changes. Because he comes back to his apartment in Berlin, his room in Berlin from Frankfurt, and waiting for him there are Gestapo agents who arrest him. Because in October 1938, all Jews holding Polish passports were arrested and ejected from the country. So they give him a few minutes to pack. Of course, he doesn't pack any clothes. He packs manuscripts. Has to leave his books. Has to leave some of his manuscripts. And they take him to a place where there's other Jews with Polish passports, some of whom had lived in Germany for 2 or 3 generations, waiting to board a train to take them eastward. So they all board the train going eastward. The train gets to the border between Germany and Poland, and they make everybody get off the train, and they build a detention camp on the border. And there he is. No buildings, just barbed wire around. Somehow he manages, through contacts with relatives in Warsaw, to get out of the detention camp, to go to Warsaw, and he gets a job teaching in Warsaw at the Institute for Jewish Science, a small academic institution of Jewish studies founded by the greatest of Polish Jewish historians, Mayor Balagan, and one of the leading liberal Polish rabbis, Moshe Shor. So he's teaching there. Obviously the school isn't going to be going anywhere, but it's a job. And he's trying to figure out now, how do I get out of Warsaw? Can I get back to Germany? Do I want to get back to Germany? Should I go somewhere else? His brother had already immigrated to London. Should I go to London? But how can I get to London? And he had no money, and he had no visa, and had a Polish passport. So what should he do? Now, I want to make a footnote to the story now and mention that Moshe Shor, who was the director of the Polish Institute in Warsaw and one of the co-founder, in 1945, Heschel was already in New York, and just beginning at the Jewish Theological Seminary. A Festschrift was published in honor of Moshe Shor. Festschrift is a volume of essays published in honor of a scholar, usually on occasion of a birthday, like usually 70, 75 year birthday. And so a Feshrift was published in honor of Moshe Shor. And Heshcel, for his contribution to the Feshrift, submitted an article which was a critical edition of a manuscript of Abulafia. This 13th century, rather bizarre mystic from 13th century Spain, who is the father of the school of mysticism called today prophetic mysticism, and the father of probably most of the forms of what is called today Jewish meditation. And Heschel published in the Feshrift for Moshe Shor in 1945 this manuscript by Abulafia that he found at the Jewish Theological Seminary library, and he wrote a kind of introduction and commentary to the text of that manuscript, which had never been published before. Now, Moshe Dell, who was the world authority on Kabbalah today, told me that when he was looking for a dissertation topic, by chance, he came upon the Feshrift in honor of Moshe Shor and found Heschel's article there on Abulafia, and that's what got him into the field of Jewish mysticism. And he wrote his dissertation on, it's about 3 volumes, and he wrote, on Abulafia, based on that manuscript that Heshcel published. Of course, then he had never heard of Heshcel, and later on he evinced a great interest in Heshcel. But it was really Heshcel who started him off, because Edel was not, as you read in a lot of the press, a student of Gershon Shalom. He never studied with Gershon Shalom. Never took a course with him, never, maybe talked to him once, but that was about it. Nothing to do with Gershon Shalom. He spent his whole career debunking the theories of Gershon Shalom. His teacher, Edel's, was a man by the name of Shlomo, excuse the way it's pronounced in Hebrew, Penis. In English, it's P-I-N-E-S. So in America, we pronounce it Pines. But in Hebrew, it's pronounced Penis. And that was his teacher. And this is the famous guy who translated Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed into English, the classic University of Chicago edition. I don't want to get into all the jokes we used to have about, this book because of the name of the translator. I'll get into that. But that was his teacher at the Hebrew University, who was basically in medieval Jewish philosophy. Not in this. How did he get into this? He found Heschel's article. And why did he start with Abulafia? Because that was the article that Heschel published in honor of Moshe Shor, who was the only one who would give him a job in Warsaw when he was forced to come back after he was deported from Germany in October 1938. All right, so he's sitting around in Warsaw, and his mother is still there. His sisters are still there. There's a lot of family there. And, you have to ask the question, did he do the right thing? All he was trying to do is to figure out how to get out of there. Well, he has a mother there. He has sisters there. Their families are there. His brother had already left for London. His father was dead since the First World War, as I mentioned. Was it the right thing to do? So I'll leave you with, like Fox News says, I report, you decide. So you can decide yourself. But all he was doing then was to try to figure out how to get out of there. He had the brother in London, so London was a good place to go. In 1938, wasn't yet the war. He was in Poland, wasn't yet the war. Why couldn't he stay there? But rather, he tried to figure out a way to get to the United States. So he's writing letters to Buber to try to figure out how to get to Palestine. He's not going to get there. Buber doesn't want to help him. There's no job openings apparent in England. And then one day, to his surprise, he's in Warsaw, and he receives a letter from Julian Morgenstern, the president of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And Julian Morgenstern writes to him and says that he's offering him a position in Bible and Jewish philosophy at Hebrew Union College. Well, this is the ticket out. Bible, because of his book on the prophets, and Jewish philosophy because of his studies on Maimonides, and also studies that he published in German in the 30s on the earlier Jewish philosopher and poet, Solomon ibn Gabirol. The problem is, how does he get a visa? And how does he get out? And Morgenstern can't send him any money in Poland, but he can send money to England, and he can get a visa at an American consulate in England. So he's got to figure out a way to get to England. Now we know that Hebrew Union College, unlike, I would say, unfortunately, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and unlike some of the yeshivot, Hebrew Union College made a concerted effort through political means to get Jewish scholars and students out of Europe in the 30s. It's sort of embarrassing to the conservative movement that the Jewish Theological Seminary never made any real such efforts. And many of the yeshivot, some of them did, but many of them made no such efforts. And Hebrew Union College, and now we have the minutes of the committees that met trying to figure out who they should invite, who they should try to get out. And eventually they got out 10 scholars. Not all of them ended up serving on the faculty at Hebrew Union College, but some did. And one of them we were discussing before, who went to Tucson, Arizona, when there was no Jews in Tucson, Arizona, Rabbi Marcus Breger. So Heshcel is one of the 10. Now the other thing that's rather surprising, especially to Jews who worship Roosevelt above God, was that Roosevelt's biggest nemesis in Congress was the guy who arranged all this. And that was Senator Robert Taft of Ohio. Morgenstern, the president of Hebrew Union College is in Cincinnati. Taft was their senator. Morgenstern went to Taft. And he said, look, Stephen Wise and the Democrats and all Roosevelt's Jewish cronies, they're not helping us. We've got to get these people out. Can you help us? And Taft helped them. So Robert Taft, who's the son of the president, Taft, was responsible for these scholars who were ransomed by Hebraian, who were gotten out by Hebraian College, didn't pay a ransom, but they helped them get out. Got the visas, got the financial supports, got the endorsements, because they had to show that refugees would be financially supported once they came over. Taft was key in this enterprise, and Morgenstern, who was the president of Hebraian College, he was sort of the one behind the whole thing. So to make a long story short, Heschel got himself to London, leaving his mother and sisters, all of whom subsequently died. Two of them in the camps. Mother never even got to the camps. It was too much for her before the camps. She died before. And he gets to England where his brother is. And he's living with his brother and trying to get to an American consulate to get the visa to come to America. Eventually he gets the visa.
Rabbi, how did he get the visa to England?
I don't think he needed a visa to England.
Well, England closed its door. It wasn't taking a lot of Polish Jews in the 30s.
Was or wasn't?
Was not.
Well, it may be because he had the letter of invitation from Morgan.
Because once he was in England, he was safe.
Pardon me?
Once he was in England, he was safe.
Once he was in England, he was safe, but he didn't want to stay there.
Yeah.
You know, there's a very famous story about an Orthodox rabbi in Poland who got a visa, who got an invitation to come to America, and he needed the visa, and he went to the consulate in London. Heshcel didn't go to the consulate in London. He went to the consulate in Scotland. Because the word was that the consulate in London wouldn't issue visas. And the reason was because you know who was our ambassador then?
Joe Kennedy.
Joe Kennedy. And there's a story, which I've read in a number of sources, that an Orthodox rabbi came from Poland to London to get the visa to come to America for himself and his family. And Kennedy wouldn't give him the visa. And he put a curse on Kennedy and his descendants. He said, because you wouldn't save my family, your family will suffer death and destruction. And he went back to Poland, and he and his whole family were killed, and the curse apparently came true. It's a very well-known story in certain circles. But Heschel didn't go to Kennedy. Heschel went to Scotland because that's where you went if you wanted to get the visa. And he got the visa.
Can you say anything quick, probably not, about why conservative and yeshivot weren't helping get Jews out?
Well, I
Was HEC
don't
talking to them and they weren't, or?
Well, I don't really know. I haven't looked into it. I mean, one reason could be because they weren't politically connected then. And Morgenstern through Taft was politically connected. I mean, remember, no, I guess you don't remember, I don't remember either, when they had the famous speech in 1947 at the United Nations, which was a new thing then, about the partition of Palestine. Who gave this speech for the Jews? It wasn't Ben Gurion, who didn't speak English that well. It wasn't Avi Eban, who did speak English that well. It wasn't Stephen Wise, Roosevelt's great buddy. It wasn't any of those guys. Who was it? Who?
Silver.
Avi Silver. From? Where was he from? was a rabbi of the biggest Reform synagogue in Cleveland, called The Temple. Remember the synagogue called The Temple? Because it was the temple. It was a rebuilding of the temple. And Abiel Silver was Taft's rabbi. So, not by chance that he was from Ohio. You know, Ohio still plays a big role in politics today. So Hebrew Union College, they were connected, and they made the efforts. Jewish Theological Seminary, you have to remember, until after 45, when Finkelstein came in as the chancellor, in Hebrew Union College, coming from the Heshcel. And here you could see how the German Jews were not, the people from the Heshcel who were called liberal Jews were not, as reformed as radically reformed as the American Jews. Schalman comes, the 5 students from Germany come to Cincinnati, and the first Sunday morning they're in America, they're invited to Morgenstern's house for brunch. So they come to Morgenstern's house. What's the first thing they do? Put on the yarmulke. Morgenstern says, "This is America, gentlemen, remove their hats." Okay, take off the hat. Then they sit down for dinner, for brunch. And what do they serve? Ham and eggs. Traditional Sunday brunch. They wouldn't eat. First they had to say, they wouldn't say the motzi, because you don't say motzi over trade, right? So they wouldn't say the blessing, they wouldn't eat. So they're sitting there, they're not eating. And Morgenstern, you see the steam coming out of his head. So they eat around, what they served. Then from there, they go to Hebrew Union College. Why? Chapel. So they walk into chapel at Hebrew Union College. The little shul. What is the first thing they do when they walk into the little shul? Put back the yarmulke. No. Morgan says, "You are in a house of worship. Remove your hat." And Morgenstern calls them all in, and they have Shabbos service on Sunday in Hebrew Union College in the chapel. So they're all confused. Next day, Morgenstern calls them in, and he says, "If I ever see you wearing one of those things on your head again, or if you don't eat what you are served, which is rude, we will send you back." So this is the Hebrew Union College into which Heshcel walks in. And you can see that these are German Jewish students from the Hospital Chaplaincy in Berlin, where Heshcel had received his ordination and where he had studied. It's very different than American reform. But that was American reform in the Morgenstern era at Hebrew Union College. There was no substantial Jewish community in Cincinnati, so there was nowhere for him to run away. And he's there from 1940 to 1945, hearing all kinds of rumors about the decimation of the Jewish communities in Europe, including Warsaw, which he had left his family at, and with no real information. Can't get any information. The war's on. He doesn't know if his mother is alive, doesn't know if his sisters are alive, doesn't know if his cousins are alive, doesn't know. He has rumors. But very little is reported in the press, very little on the radio. And he meets leaders of the American Jewish community, for example, at 2 big conferences of Jewish leaders, one held in 1943 and one held in 1944. And his impression is that none of them really care what's going on in Europe. They're not really interested in doing anything about what's going on in Europe. All they're really interested in is what's going to happen when the war is over. And are the Jews from over there going to want to come over here? Because we don't want them over here. And we have to figure out what to do with them if we don't want them over here. So it's an atmosphere which is very stressful for him and very foreign for him. Not to mention, he didn't know English. And he comes over here, he's in Cincinnati, he can't teach classes because the students don't know German and he doesn't know English. So he has to learn English. Now, one of the first things he writes after he gets here, again for an anniversary, is a series of monographs later collected into a book on the first great medieval Jewish philosopher, Gaon. And I remember Finkelstein telling me that in 1945, when Heshcel came to the Jewish Theological Seminary, he gave Finkelstein a copy of his work on Gaon, which had been collected into a little book, because originally it was discrete essays. And Finkelstein opened it up and started to read it and said to him, "It's all in English. How'd you learn English so fast?" And Heshcel said, "I heard that Jack London used to write words in English that he didn't know. To increase his vocabulary, he'd write words every day in shaving cream on his mirror in the morning when he washed and shaved, and I did the same thing. And if you want, I can tell you, as you look, you point to any word in this book, and I'll tell you what day I learned it." So here he was in a totally hostile, strange environment, living with, not with his peers, but with students who were studying for the American students, studying for the rabbinate, who had no clue who he was, didn't understand him, and used to spend a lot of time playing practical jokes on him. Like, putting a balloon on the door, a water balloon on the door, when you open it, it falls down, and condoms on the doorknobs, and short sheeting the bed, and all this kind of stuff. Welcome to America. Now, in all this chaos and depressing situation, he finds a colleague who becomes a friend. First of all, his best friend at Hebrew Union College was this African-American guy who was a janitor there. That was his best friend. And Kaplan, in his biography of Heshcel, attributes Heschel's involvement with the civil rights movement to his relationship with this guy. I think there's something to it, but it's more complicated than that. But definitely he had a relation. Because I don't know if, you ever witnessed it, but Cincinnati was basically a southern city in those days. And there were these black people serving white people like during the Civil War. I remember when I went to visit the Rabbi of Sinai congregation many years ago, this ultra-reformed synagogue. We're sitting in his study under a picture of his predecessor, Rabbi David Einhorn, and this huge mahogany table, mahogany chairs, about 300 years old or something, bell, and a black guy comes in with a silver tray, dressed in white with silver gloves, and serves us tea off the silver tray with little crumpets. This is how it was in Cincinnati in those days. It's hard to imagine today. They used to give courses in the rabbinical school in Cincinnati in those days in manners, in etiquette. Talmud they didn't know. Talmud they never studied there in Cincinnati, forget that. But they had a course in etiquette. Suppose you're invited to some, donor's house for tea and crumpets. You have to know how to use the right spoon. You have to know the right thing to say. Suppose you're invited to the Gentile country club. They wouldn't invite Jews there, but they would invite rabbis there. So you have to behave the right way. They had courses given at Hebrew Union College to eliminate foreign accents.
Out of pass.
Pardon me?
Out of pass.
Yeah, and
Upper-class
the
Boston
placement
American.
office clearly, favored you. The taller you were, and the more blonde you were, if you were blue-eyed, you had a better chance at a better job. The taller rabbis got the better congregation. Of course, there weren't too many taller rabbis then. They were usually pretty small guys. So that was the Hebrew Union College in which he was living. So he had this friend, I forgot his name, Henry, the janitor, and on the faculty, only one guy he hung around with. Let's see if any of you ever heard of this guy. Any of you grew up in the Reform movement? No. Oh, you did. I probably never heard of him. A very interesting guy. And unfortunately, in the biography, Kaplan really doesn't do him justice. Abraham Cronbach, no one ever heard of him, right? That's unfortunate. Abraham Cronbach was one of the first graduates of Hebrew Union College, one of the first Reform rabbis. And he had a congregation in Indiana. And he was very involved in his early career in interfaith relations with the Christians. And so he and the Christian pastor in the town in which he had his congregation in Indiana, I forgot what the city was, probably, I think Elkhart, used to switch pulpits all the time. Then, as it happened, the pastor died. So the church asked Cronbach if he would help out, because he was already giving sermons there every once in a while. So he sort of, until they got a new pastor, if he would help out. So he was sort of helping them out as a clergyman in the church. Then his synagogue came to the conclusion, because in these little towns, you have all kinds of Jews in the same synagogue. So they're really not one group or another. So his synagogue decided he was too liberal for them, so they fired him. The church hired him as the clergyman of the church, and the leadership in Hebrew Union College thought that this was too embarrassing if it got out, that one of their star graduates was now the pastor of a big Protestant church in Indiana. There's a journal called the American Jewish Archives, which is published by the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. And there's one issue of that journal, I think published in the 60s or the 50s, which is, the issue is totally his autobiography. So you can find it all there. I mean, It's an incredibly interesting read. You don't hear another story about this. So Hebrew Union College was very embarrassed. They didn't know what to do, so they figured, what can we do? We'll hire him for the faculty. So they hire him on the faculty of Hebrew Union College. But he doesn't really know very much of classical sources. So they figured since he served in the pulpit, they'll make him professor of pastoral counseling. And he became the first one in America to advocate the use of Freudian psychoanalysis for pastoral counseling. And he published articles, I think they're in the Hebrew Union College Annual, or one of the Reformed scholarly publications, on the use of psychoanalysis in pastoral counseling. Let me just finish the story about him. Then, in 1938, you heard about the Kristallnacht, right? And you know what started the Kristallnacht?
Polish Jew who's assassinated a German official. I can't remember.
Right, a Polish Jew named Greenspan assassinated a functionary, he wasn't even a member of the Nazi Party, in the German consulate in Paris by the name of von Rath, and they used that as an excuse to start the Kristallnacht. Cronbach believed that we had to be universalists. Jews had to have a universalistic ethic. So we had to raise money and help our enemies. So he started a fundraising campaign for von Rath's family. Every Sunday, he would go to conduct services and would take Heshcel along with him to what was called in those days, in Cincinnati, a home for unwed mothers. So I think once a month, he and Heshcel would go to the home for unwed mothers, and Cronbach would conduct a service, and they would have different unwed mothers there. After they gave birth, they would leave, and he would tell them the story about Hagar being thrown out by Abraham because she was pregnant and had this little kid, and into the wilderness and the whole business, and how God helped them, and how God's going to help them, and the whole business. So Heshcel used to go with him to this. Cronbach became interested in ideas of helping, the poor and the indigent and the disabled and all this. And apparently Heshcel might have mentioned to him a book in the Middle Ages called the Sefer Hasidim, which discussed some of these themes of social welfare. And if you look in Hebrew Union College Annual, you will find 2 or 3 studies by Cronbach on social welfare in the Sefer Hasidim. My guess is they were really written by Heshcel, because I don't think Cronbach knew Hebrew. But here's what made Cronbach very famous in America, and why you should know who he is, besides his relationship with Heshcel. In the early 1950s, today everybody talks about the O.J. Simpson trial as the trial of the century, 20th century. But in the 50s, what was the trial of the century?
Rosenbergs.
The Rosenbergs. And when the Rosenbergs were condemned to be executed, and they were, communists, and they were atheists, so they didn't ask for a rabbi, but Cronbach volunteered. And Cronbach was the Rosenbergs' rabbi. He used to go visit them in the prison, both of them. a Rosenberg's rabbi. So that's who Cronbach was, Heschel's good buddy. Whether or not any of this had any influence on Heschel's later activity in social action, I can't say. But I guess when you're in desperate situations, you reach out for people that in other situations you might not have reached out for. And in this case, it was Cronbach, who was, you know, the total opposite in just about every way of Heschel at the time. Mr. Gonzalez, you had a question?
Well, it's interesting, Freudian psychology and pastoral care, because when I started studying to be a chaplain, I didn't understand how they thought that ministry and psychology could work together. And it took me a long time to understand the Christian perspective on that, and how a lot of pastors take counseling and biblical counseling and things like that in school. And I never knew that there was a Jewish version of that, or where did that come from the Jewish side with Rabbi. So, and I've never heard him mention, and so it wasn't until I took biblical psychology that I saw it here as coming from a Jewish standpoint, but I don't know much about that still being used from a Jewish perspective with clergymen.
Probably not. Because until very recently, you had Freudian psychoanalysts teaching pastoral counseling at the seminaries. So they weren't teaching anything having to do with religion. They were teaching, you know, upfront Freudian psychoanalysis. When I was in rabbinical school in the 60s, all the people who were teaching pastoral psychiatry were Freudian analysts. I was in a special program with Heshcel, you know, to study classical texts and stuff, so I never took, you know, courses like pastoral psychiatry, homiletics. I didn't have to take any of this, but my classmates did, and all of the people who were teaching them in pastoral psychiatry were Freudian analysts. So, you know, they would come back from these classes, and, you know, it was just mind-boggling to me what they would tell me. I mean, I remember one of my classmates came back and he spent an hour and a half over lunch. I couldn't even eat the lunch after telling me how the Freudian psychoanalysis interpret the mezuzah. And his first statement was, well, you know what Freud said about things that are longer than they are wide. And went on from that.
Sometimes the mezuzah is just the mezuzah.
Pardon me?
But that's the kind of stuff that I have to deal with. Like, I had no clue what they were talking about, and they were saying, oh, well, there's a long history of ministers using psychoanalysis and clinical perspectives in their work.
Right.
And I'm like, from where? Like, how?
Right, I had the same problem. And I still have the same problem, but at least now we have alternatives. Then they didn't have alternatives. Then there were no alternatives. You know, there's a ceremony at many synagogues where when a boy becomes bar mitzvah, his parents take the prayer shawl and they put it on his shoulders, drape it on him. You wouldn't even want to know what this guy did with that.
Yes, I would like.
Yeah.
I do that all the time.
But like,
They had this kid in analysis, and he had this dream of his father pulling the tallis off him. So this is, of course, symbolic castration. The wish of every father toward every son, according to Freud. And that therefore putting it on is the opposite.
okay, imagine them doing that to you while you're trying to visit patients. Because every time we visit a patient, we would go back to our supervisor and tell them about our visit. And they would say, well, how does that relate to your childhood? And how does that relate to this? And, yeah,
Oh, I know. It's enough to make you sick. You're already in the hospital. You need this. I mean, I know you're time I've been in the hospital, they've done all the wrong things. You know, I'm lying there in the hospital with the tubes, and I haven't eaten or drunk anything for 5 days, and the chaplain comes in, the rabbi, who I happen to know. So I saw your name on the patient list. I thought you'd come in and say hello. I said, hello. Well, Shabbos is coming, and he says, you know, I can't afford it on my budget, but the Lubavitch give me this challah and wine for you to have for Shabbos. I said, you see the tubes? You see the catheters? You think I'm going to have wine and challah tonight? Go away. You know, and Catholic hospitals are even better because the priests, you know, they come in. Anything we can do for you? Yeah. They don't take no for an answer. So, that's the reason I never became a chaplain. There was another hand. Ms. Rubin, did you ever?
We're long past it. I was just looking at the syllabus and trying to figure out if I knew who we were. No, I just wanted to say, on a purely, since you enjoy trivia and things like that, the Rosenberg.
No, I don't enjoy trivia. I just use it to spice up the class because it's so long.
Oh, okay. I lived across the street from the Rosenbergs. And so I spent my
really?
Yeah, on the Lower East Side. And so naturally, I heard a lot about them growing up, not that I really wanted to. And sometimes my father would point out their window when we walked down their street. So it's kind of funny, you know, just coincidences of history.
Well, Cronbach was their rabbi, what can I tell you? In 1945, finally Heshcel escapes from Hebrew Union College by accepting Finkelstein's invitation to join the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary. The obvious question then is, why does Finkelstein invite him there? He doesn't invite him there because he needed somebody in the field of Jewish mysticism, because Jewish mysticism was not considered to be, at that time, a legitimate field of Jewish scholarship. That only happened in the 70s. He didn't invite them there because he needed somebody in Jewish philosophy, because they weren't teaching Jewish philosophy there. They didn't invite him there because they had any shortage of great Jewish scholars, because they had all the great Jewish scholars who had escaped from or survived the Holocaust, who either went there or went to Israel. So why did Finkelstein invite him there? He didn't invite him there because he wanted any competition to his own charisma. Of course, nobody could really compete with him, but he didn't worry about that. So why did he invite him there? It seems that he invited him because he was afraid of the impact of Mordechai Kaplan. That Finkelstein understood that Kaplan did not intend to start a movement of his own. It was never his intention. His intention was that the conservative movement would be the future of American Judaism, that orthodoxy was a kind of remnant of European Judaism that would disappear, and that Reform Judaism would assimilate out of existence, and there'd only be the conservatives. And the conservatives would be, in Kaplan's view, like the parliament, with a left wing, a center, and a right wing, and that the Reconstructionists would be the left wing. That was Kaplan's plan. Finkelstein saw things pretty much the same way, except in his view, it would not be the left wing that would control the show. And that's what he was afraid of. because Kaplan's views were becoming enormously popular. A lot of the graduates of the seminary, the rabbis, were becoming followers of Kaplan. They were becoming rabbis of growing substantial congregations, and a lot of them were becoming ideologically and even ritually influenced by Kaplan's ideas. And Finkelstein, who was extremely right-wing, so right-wing that he would not even attend a conservative synagogue where men and women sat together. If he would speak at a conservative synagogue, he'd come at the end of the service. He would come during the service. He didn't want the left wing, led by the Kaplan group, to become powerful, and particularly wanted to somehow neutralize or stifle or limit Kaplan's influence on the upcoming generations of conservative rabbis who were being trained at the school. So he needed a counterbalance. He needed somebody with impeccable credentials, somebody observant, somebody with traditional ideas, someone with some charisma, not too much, and that was Heschel, who he had met when he first came to America in 1940. Yeah.
I was under the impression that Finkelstein held Heschel back and isolated him at JTS. If he brought him there to raise up, and you needed somebody to be raised up to balance Kaplan, who was huge. That doesn't seem to fit, unless I've got it wrong.
It depends on what years you're talking about, because remember, Kaplan left and went to live in Israel, for a long time, which nobody expected. The constituency of students after the war changed. So all of a sudden, Kaplan's ideas were not as... Kaplan's ideas were very, let me put it this way, Kaplan's ideas were very, very attractive to a generation of rabbis or rabbinical students, mostly who had come from very traditional homes, who saw it as innovative and new and bold and creative and all this. And that's the generation you had before the war, and let's say during the war. After the war, you began to have people coming in who were not coming out of those backgrounds. So he didn't really have that problem that much anymore. Also remember the age discrepancy. Nobody knew Kaplan was going to live till 102. He was born in 81. So in 1945 he was what? 60 already or something like this. And Heshcel was born in 1907, so he came in 1945. He was in the 30s. So it was part of a long-range plan, not, just then, and things happened that nobody expected. But Finkelstein, when Heshcel, you're right, because when Heshcel began to become too charismatic, which was mostly unpopular, which was mostly in the 60s, mostly because of his writing and mostly because of his social action work, Finkelstein did try to put him down, but Kaplan wasn't an issue really then. Remember, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College starts in 1968. So already by the 60s, the split had almost occurred. So, and Kaplan had come back from Israel, but he wasn't really, active there. The movement was taking off by itself, so it really wasn't an issue then. But earlier, in 45, it was still a big issue. Because you had a lot of young conservative rabbis of that time trying to turn their congregations into Reconstructionist congregations, including yours. Because Kaplan's son-in-law was your rabbi there in the Chamber congregation. So.
And at my father's, my father and the board had a huge fight with our rabbi, and not Don Chandler, a different one, who wanted, and the board won, stayed conservative. But
yeah, so that was a real issue. Finkelstein wanted to keep these congregations in the fold. Now, if you read, by the way, Ira Eisenstein, Kaplan's son-in-law's autobiography, he says, my 5 years in Chicago were the worst 5 years of my life. So he obviously didn't have a good time here. And Kaplan's daughter, Judith Eisenstein, Kaplan Eisenstein, taught at our school, taught Jewish music here for many years. She was a very eminent musicologist. And New Year's Eve, 1968-69, I was at Heshcel's house for a New Year's Eve party, and I sat down. All the people were like 100 years older than I was then. And I sit down, and there's this elderly woman sitting next to me, and I started talking to her, and it ended up it was Judith Eisenstein, whose husband I had met before, but I never met her. And I turned, and she introduced herself, and she probably thought I was going to ask her something about her father. And I said, is it true that you were the first bat mitzvah girl in 1922? She said, yes. I said, well, tell me about it. So she told me the whole story of the first bat mitzvah, which was her.
mm-hmm.
But, so anyway, so that's how and why Heschel came to JTS. In 1946, he married Sylvia Strauss of Cleveland, a concert pianist who he had met in Cincinnati the year before. And in 1945 and 46, the story of the events of what happened in Europe during the war became known. The Holocaust became known in the United States. And one of the things that happened was that the Evo Institute, which an institution that had started in Lithuania and had now moved to New York, sponsored a program in memory of the Jews of Eastern Europe and invited Heshcel to give the keynote address to an audience of mostly secular Yiddishists on the East European Jew in Yiddish. His book, The Earth is the Lord's, is a later, rather different English version of that Yiddish book. When he finished that lecture, the East European Jew at Evo, everybody spontaneously, even though they're all secularists, got up and recited the morning Scottish. In the manuscript of the East European Jew, you will find Heschel's view that the future viability of world Jewry, especially of American Jewry, will be determined by whether it can continue the heritage of East European Jewry, which, according to Heshcel, is the highest form attained by the Jewish spirit. So here you have the ironic situation that precisely at the time, in American Jewish history, the late 40s, early 50s, when American Jewry is turning away from its East European roots, and American Jews are turning away from their East European Jewish roots, Heschel is trying to make the case that the only way world Jewry, particularly American Jewry, will remain viable in the future will be if it returns to its East European Jewish roots, because of the claim he makes, which is that of all of the communities in the history of Judaism, from biblical times until now, the most spiritually advanced Jewish community was precisely the community that was destroyed during the Holocaust, namely the East European and particularly the Polish Jewish community. Furthermore, ironically, precisely at the time, in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, when American Jewry is searching for a model of how to be a Jew in America, and is looking to the history of Sephardic Jewry for that model, namely for a bicultural model, for living in two cultures at the same time, Heschel is arguing that's not the place to look. The place to look is to the East European model, particularly to the mysticism, the spirituality, and the Hasidic teachings of the East European model, which were the most neglected in all levels of the curriculum of American Jewish education. Heschel convinced, however, the leadership of YIVO to try to recover as much as possible of the East European Jewish heritage. And he himself began work on preliminary studies for a book on the founder of Hasidism, namely the Baal Shem Tov. And the preliminary studies that he already began to write in the early 50s, a number of which were published, were studies on what were members of what was called the circle of the Baal Shem Tov, namely the scholars and the disciples and the colleagues who clustered around the Baal Shem Tov in the first generation of Hasidism. And these studies are now been translated into English in this book called The Circle of the Baal Shem Tov. And so these studies were published, most of them in Hebrew, some in Yiddish, and are now available in English translation. But he never got to the goal being to write a spiritual biography of the Baal Shem Tov. So he wrote studies of the Baal Shem Tov's influence and brother-in-law, Rabbi Gershon Titover. He wrote a study of the Baal Shem Tov's colleague, Rabbi Nachman of Kassak, Nicholas of Koretz, Yitzhak of Drobshitz, but never really got to the goal, which was to write the biography of the Baal Shem Tov himself. In the 1940s, Heschel also wrote a number of articles on different religious phenomena, such as faith and piety, all of which were preliminary studies for his first major book in English, and that was his Philosophy of Religion, Man is Not Alone, published in 1951. Also in 1951, Heschel published The Sabbath. In which he describes Judaism as a religion primarily of time, not of space. This, to jump ahead some years, caused a major problem for him when he accepted a commission from the ADL after the Six-Day War to write a book about Israel, which is called Israel Echo of Eternity. Because the whole idea of Israel is the sanctification of space. So if you've already spent a whole career trying to establish the view that Judaism is basically a religion focusing on the attempt to sanctify time, how do you now deal with this issue of the sanctification of space? And I don't really think the book makes it. I don't really think the book accomplishes this. What the book does do, however, which was one of its goals and one of the reasons the ADL financed it, was to have him write the sections trying to convince Christians to support Israel. I think those are the most effective parts of the book. You can also see, by the way, because of the many quotes in that book of the Rabbi of Kutz, that Heshcel was interrupting his work on his last book on the Rabbi of Kutz to write this book on Israel. And I worked with him on the book on Israel. And basically it's pieces sort of woven together rather than really a cohesive book. It's like little, as one reviewer would put it, little pearls on a string rather than a comprehensive portrait. In 1951, also, Heshcel was asked to give two speeches. One to the Reform Rabbinate, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and one to the Conservative Rabbinate. And his original plan was to talk about two issues, one to each. Originally, his plan was to speak to the Reform rabbis about prayer, and to talk to the conservative rabbis about Jewish law, because that was what each group was more interested in. Just before he had to speak to the first convention, he reversed them. And he went to the conservative rabbis and talked to them about prayer, and went to the Reform rabbis who had denounced the idea that Jewish law is binding, and talked to them about Jewish law and why it should be binding. And here again you see always the underlying polemical tone. In the article about prayer, he talks about Judaism as the art of surpassing civilization. Again, a slap at Kaplan's view of Judaism as a civilization. He talks against trying to reduce Judaism to symbols and sancta. Sancta was Kaplan's translation of mitzvot. Kaplan said Judaism doesn't have commandments because there's no commander, because God is no longer supernatural in Kaplan's view. So you have just things that the community holds as sacred, called sancta, which he uses the term from mitzvot. So Heshcel says you can't have sancta and you can't have symbols. He says when you hold up a piece of matzah, it's not a symbol of something else, it's a piece of matzah. When a Christian holds up a piece of matzah, he says it's the body of Christ. It's a symbol. For us, it's a piece of matzah. It's not the body of God or anything like this. And in that, he was polemicizing against Finkelstein, because Finkelstein had written a very famous essay called Judaism as a System of Symbols. Where it says, we have things. A thing is what it is. It's not a symbol of something else. It's what it is. When you make a blessing over the bread, it's not over a symbol, it's over bread. So there too, you have polemics. In 1952 is the birth of his only child, Susanna Heschel, in May of 1952. In 1955 comes Heschel's most important English book, God in Search of Man, which I'll have more to say about later. But I want to move first to say a word about Heschel as a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary during these years. Ironically, Heschel's title was not Professor of Jewish Mysticism, was not Professor of Jewish Philosophy or Bible, as it had been at Hebrew Union College, but was Professor of Jewish Ethics and Mysticism. It was actually the Rabbi Ralph Simon Chair of Jewish Ethics and Mysticism. Ralph Simon was a conservative rabbi here in Chicago. And one of his laymen, named Maxwell Bell, was one of the biggest donors to the seminary under Finkelstein's era. I don't want to get into that whole story, but that's where the chair came from. The ironic thing is, Finkelstein did not allow Heschel to teach either one, either ethics or mysticism. And the second thing is, what does one have to do with the other? Ethics and mysticism. In most views, nothing. In Heschel's views, everything.
So was that Heschel's choice of?
No, professors never have the choice. It's an endowed chair, it means you get a few more dollars, so you don't get a choice. The choice is to accept the chair, not to accept the chair. But I don't know too many stories of people turning it down. In the rabbinical school, he would teach only 1 hour a week. On alternate years, it would be either a course on Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed or Judah Halevi's Kuzari. That's an academic hour, which means 50 minutes. Not a lot. And he was a lousy teacher to a class of students, as opposed to a great teacher in his seminars, because there he had his hand-picked students. And the students responded in kind. They didn't pay much attention to his class, because he didn't take it very seriously. In the lower division of the seminary, the Teachers College, which trained mostly Jewish educators, he was giving very elementary level courses, like Chumash with Rashi's commentary, or he was teaching sometimes books of the prophets, but nothing very, very advanced, and not Jewish philosophy, and certainly not Jewish mysticism, which wasn't part of the curriculum. So he put his efforts into other things than teaching. One, obviously, was into the writings, a lot of which I already discussed. But in the late 50s and early 60s, he began to be involved with social issues. And many of his speeches on social issues that were connected to his activities on social issues like civil rights and like interfaith relations were collected in a volume called The Insecurity of Freedom. And many of the later activities in social issues are found in the later book, Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity. Now, I'll just make one more point. In Heschel's book on Maimonides, as I mentioned to you, one of the points he makes is that in his later life, Maimonides made, in Heschel's view, a major shift from thinking to doing, from being involved in intellectual issues to being primarily involved in social issues in the Jewish community and in his medical practices. I would suggest to you that what Heschel saw happening in Maimonides' life actually previsaged what happened in his own life. That in his later life, he moved, particularly as he says in the television interview with Carl Stern, which was his last interview 3 days before he died, that his work on his book on the prophets in English, which came out in 1962, helped bring about this shift from a focus on academic scholarship and thinking to social action, including civil rights, Soviet Jewry, Vietnam, and interfaith relations, which were the big 4 areas of social action in which he worked. I would also suggest that a lot of his activity in social action, which began in the late 50s, early 60s, but especially in the 60s, were responses to his experiences in Nazi Germany and his response to the Holocaust. Even though in the 60s, one of the major criticisms of Heschel was that he did not adequately respond to the Holocaust. My friend Morris Firestein wrote a very brilliant essay called Heschel's Response to the Holocaust, in which he shows that a lot of his thinking and a lot of his social action was really his way. He didn't talk a lot about it, but he did a lot about it, and he wrote a lot about it, but not overtly.
Really? Couldn't you think his posthumous, his last book, A Passion for Truth, was his trying to get his arms around that, the post-Holocaust theology and
No, I think you find it throughout the books.
oh, not just, okay.
Where
And
do you
that's what
find
Firestein shows. And Firestein, who was a great Yiddishist, shows that already in the 60s, in interviews Heschel gave to the Yiddish press, there's a tremendous wrestling with the Holocaust there.
Did Firestein write in English?
Firestein, yeah.
I mean,
On
in general, yeah, but I mean on Heschel defending him in terms of addressing the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's all in English.
And where?
Not just Yiddish. Where?
I don't remember exactly where it is. I'll have to dig it out, but it's there.
So why was he only allowed to teach for an hour a week?
Pardon me?
Why was Heschel only allowed to teach for an hour a week, especially if he was there to kind of counter Kaplan?
Because Kaplan was already retired by then. He was only allowed to teach an hour a week in the rabbinical school. There was another division below the rabbinical school, the Teachers Institute, which trained Jewish educators. There he was teaching maybe 15 hours a week. But in the rabbinical school itself, it was only 1 hour a week, and because Kaplan, who was brought to polemicize against, was gone. And he was polemicizing against him in his writings, and he was gaining popularity amongst the students. So and Kaplan was by then passé in the 60s. Yeah.
What years did they overlap?
Well, Heschel came to the seminary in 45, so definitely Kaplan was there in 45. I don't remember exactly when he left, when he went to Israel. But whenever that was, that's when they did not overlap. And then Kaplan came back from Israel in the late 60s, but he wasn't really that involved in the seminary. And Kaplan had great esteem for Heschel, and they got along very well. Heschel had no esteem for Kaplan's views, but his view of Kaplan was another story. He disagreed with him on everything, but they got along fairly well.
It's kind of interesting because I'm a Reconstructionist, and almost every Reconstructionist I've ever talked to completely reveres Heschel. There's just like this, just kind of curious.
Yeah, well, actually, I think it was, when was it? 71. It was right after I came here. I convinced the powers that be here then, we weren't in this building, to give Heschel an honorary doctorate because no Jewish institution had given him one. He had gotten honorary doctorates from many Christian institutions by 71. Of course, nobody expected he would be dead in 72. So I convinced the faculty here then to give him an honorary doctorate. So he came in June of 71 for the graduation ceremony. And it was on a Sunday, and we had to move it up earlier in the day because he had to fly back to New York because of Kaplan's 90th, I think it was 90th birthday party. It was 1971, so
Yeah.
it was 90th birthday party, right? So I was walking around before the ceremony in our museum gallery in our former building on 11th Street near the Essex where we were staying, and it was on 11th Street. We were walking around the gallery before the ceremony, and he's trying out, he says, let me try out some of my remarks I may make at the dinner in honor of Kaplan with you, see what you think. And he went through this whole thing because he started out with, Kaplan's wife was still alive then. And he did all this at the ceremony. He started out by comparing Kaplan and his wife to Abraham and Sarah. He had to give a speech after the dinner. So he said the first after-dinner speech in Jewish history was the speech given by one of the angels after he has dinner with Abraham at the tent. And from that, you should learn how to give an after-dinner speech. There are 3 rules. Rule number 1 that the angel introduced. Rule number 1, the angel said, the angel gave a speech. The speech was only 1 sentence. So this teaches you that the speech should be short. Secondly, we read that after the angel gave his 1-sentence speech, Sarah laughed. So this teaches you that the speech should be funny. And the speech was, by the angel said to Abraham, Sarah, your wife, will conceive and give birth to a son. And Heschel said that's the third rule of a good after-dinner speech. It should be pregnant with meaning. And then he turned to Kaplan, actually at the dinner, he turned to Kaplan and his wife and he said, "So can we expect a baby next year?" And maybe we'll call this baby Kaplan Without Supernaturalism. Kaplan wrote a very famous book, Judaism Without Supernaturalism. And he went on and on and on. And then people who were there told me, people were just falling off their chairs because you didn't usually tell jokes all the time like this. And that Heschel kept laughing and he couldn't stop. And I saw recently on television there's some disease that you can get where you start laughing and you can't stop. It's indicative of some disease. So maybe this was already an indication of his heart problems then. Because, he was dead a year and a half later. But the fact that he went back early, to go to the dinner honoring Kaplan, shows you what their relationship was. And the fact that he would give a speech like that, not a formal, withdrawn, formal speech, but, a speech like that showed that there was some camaraderie there. So, he disagreed with Kaplan on everything, but I think personally they eventually, after they, fought ideologically for many years, realized that, in a sense, personally, they were on the same wavelength. Because Kaplan, again and again, says that his goal is to try to bring about a renaissance of American Jewry, and Kaplan in his diary says very clearly that he thought he was a failure because he did not bring about this renaissance in Jewish life in America. Heshcel wanted to do the same thing, although to draw from a different wellspring than Kaplan, but the goal was more or less the same. And we're sure they agree on that. But Kaplan was a very towering personality. He didn't have any tolerance for you to disagree with him. I remember I once asked him a question, and he yelled at me, he said, "Don't Uberize me." I don't know exactly what it meant, but...
What did you ask?
I don't remember.
It was a good
But
answer.
after he said that, I was so nervous I didn't remember my name practically. But he would say things like that. I mean, he didn't tolerate dissent unless he changed his mind. If he changed his mind, okay, but you're not allowed to disagree with him. And I remember the first time I met him, he invited a few students to his house after he moved back from Israel. And he had this big wall with bookshelves, and the whole wall was filled with volumes of his diary. He kept a diary, like from the time he was 18. Every day, he wrote in it his impressions of people he met. So almost every great Jewish leader of the 20th century is somewhere in that diary. And his own most inner thoughts are in that diary. And it's hundreds of volumes. And parts of it have been published by Mel Sculpt, who's a professor at Brooklyn College in New York, who's made a lifetime study of the diary. I remember when Kaplan died, Sculpt published in a journal excerpts from Kaplan's diary. And he didn't tell you when Kaplan wrote it. critical. You had to wait for the next edition for him to tell you. And one of the biggest excerpts was Kaplan's whole section of sexual fantasies. And he gives you the date. It was like when Kaplan was 99. He was in this Jewish nursing home in New York, in Riverdale. And he was sitting in his wheelchair looking at this, old woman who was in the nursing home with him, trying to think about what she was like when she was 20 and what he was like when he was 20. And he's having all these sexual fantasies and he's writing them down in his diary. You never would have guessed that he wrote that one when he was 99. And it's only from the diaries that we know that he considered it the fascinating thing that he, with all the successes he had and the tremendous impact he made on American Jewry, probably greater than any other single figure in the 20th century, considered everything he did to be a failure. It's just astounding, because there you have his authentic views of what he thought. Even sometimes he writes down, I should be burned to death for writing this because it's Shabbos. But I had to write it down because otherwise I'd forget it. And in one place he writes, but since I'm already writing and it's Shabbos, I might as well have a cigar too. So Heschel begins to become involved in different areas of social action, and I'll just mention some details about some of them briefly. The first, of course, is the area of civil rights. And as we already discussed here, you can see some of the connections between Heschel's views on civil rights and his experiences with the situation of Jews in Nazi Germany, particularly with regard to segregation. I already discussed with you the 1963 Conference on Race and Religion here in Chicago. The most famous activity of Heschel in civil rights was probably the March in Selma, where he gave that famous line to, I forget, Woodward, not the famous Woodward. There was another guy, Ken Woodward, who was the religion editor of Newsweek, where Heschel said to him, I felt my feet were praying. But Heschel was very hesitant to go to Selma because the people in King's headquarters told him that it could be extremely physically dangerous to go down there, that he was in physical danger actually to go down there. We know that people who went to protest in Selma were attacked. There's that famous picture of Heshcel marching with Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy wearing Hawaiian leis in Selma. I mentioned to you Seymour Siegel. Seymour went down to him, with him, sort of as his bodyguard. And unfortunately, in the seminary's press release, they put a copy of that photograph of Heshcel Abernathy, and there's a black guy between Heshcel and King. There's a guy between Heshcel and King, and the seminary in the caption put that it was Siegel. And somebody sent me a Wikipedia page that was writing about Siegel, which is now on the internet. And he said Siegel marched with Heshcel and King in the middle in the March in Selma, because he was quoting the seminary publicity office. And I said, that's not Siegel. That's Ralph Bunche, who was the Undersecretary General of the United Nations. You go to the campus of UCLA, the School of International Studies is named after Ralph Bunche. I met Ralph Bunche a few times because he lived close to where I lived in New York when I was growing up. And they used to play in Forest Hills, and they used to play the U.S. Open in Forest Hills. And the Forest Hills Country Club, where they played it, Jews and blacks were not allowed. So the Jews wanted to be members of the tennis club, so they asked Ralph Bunche if he'd apply for membership. He could care less about tennis. He applied for membership, and they had to accept him because he was Undersecretary General of the UN. Once they accepted him, they had to accept Jews, and that's how Jews got in. But he opened the door for Arthur Ashe to play there. Because Arthur Ashe, the U.S. Open was still there, and Ashe was the first African-American, to play in the U.S. Open, and unless they had opened the doors, he wouldn't have been allowed to play in their, precious country club there. Precious tennis club. Anyway, so it was Bunche marching there, not Siegel, but it was very, very dangerous. And a funny story connected to it, that Heshcel, the Jewish community in Selma, asked him not to come. They said, "Don't you realize that you're endangering our lives? If you want to protest in New York, protest in New York, but you come down here." And this was a big problem during the Civil Rights Movement. Just it put Jews in the South in physical danger. Anyway, so he went down there and he was flying back from Montgomery. I think they went back to Montgomery and to fly to Atlanta and then to New York. So he hadn't eaten all day. And he and a group of the Jewish representatives drove back to Montgomery, and they're sitting in the airport waiting for the plane to go to Atlanta. They hadn't eaten all day. And Heshcel apparently wasn't feeling too well because he hadn't eaten all day. And he goes with the other rabbis to the restaurant in the airport, and they wouldn't serve him. And this waitress comes over, and they wouldn't serve him. So he said to them, "Why don't you want to serve me?" And, they said, "Well, we don't serve you people and people who hang around with those people. And besides," the waitress said, "you look like Santa Claus." So Heshcel saw this as an opening, not as something to get him upset, but as an opportunity. And he said, "You mean you wouldn't give Santa Claus a tuna fish sandwich?" And the waitress changed her mind. Comes out, serves him. "Well, I can't let Santa Claus starve." So he had something to eat before he got on the plane. Of course, in those days, they served on the plane, so you want to starve. Then came the Six-Day War, as you know, in '67, and the Jewish community, who had been spending a lot of effort and capital on interfaith relations, all of a sudden felt abandoned because the very people they were engaged in dialogue with weren't supporting Israel in the Six-Day War. I already discussed with you how Heshcel convinced King, even though he was a pacifist, to support Israel during the Six-Day War. And that brings us to interfaith relations. Now, the big shock hit the Catholic community in 1958 when John the 23rd became the Pope and called for the Second Ecumenical Council. He was considered to be a transitionary figure. He was already 78 years old. They figured, well, he'd stay around a few years, do nothing, and die, and some younger, more innovative person would be chosen, but he decided to surprise everybody and called the Second Ecumenical Council. And one of the things he absolutely insisted on was that the church reevaluate and change its views on the Jews. He had seen a lot of the Holocaust up front when he was the representative of the Vatican in Turkey, where he saved a number of Jewish children, and later in Bulgaria, where the king saved the Jews of Bulgaria, king of Bulgaria, and in France, where the Jews were not saved. He also was very influenced by a book by a Jewish historian named Jules Isaac on the history of Christian anti-Semitism. So he decided it's time to change the church dogma. Not an easy thing to do, in order to change the church's attitude toward the Jews. And that this would be one of the important developments of the Second Vatican Council. So he started the ball rolling to do this. And he appointed a cardinal to be in charge of this. And the cardinal's name was Cardinal Augustin Bea, B-E-A, Bea, who was a German cardinal and a biblical and Old Testament scholar, who happened to know Heshcel from Germany in the 30s. Bea came to America, and through Cardinal Cushing, remember him, he was Kennedy's cardinal, he tried to arrange to meet with a number of Jewish scholars and heads of Jewish organizations, particularly the American Jewish Committee, and to meet with Heshcel and to meet with Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. The meeting was held in Boston, which is where Cushing was the cardinal, and also where Soloveitchik lived. Soloveitchik declined to appear. We have nothing to talk to them about theologically. And Soloveitchik eventually wrote a position paper which has been interpreted as forbidding interfaith relation between Jews and Christians, particularly on theological subjects, which is why there have been a lot of problems getting Orthodox Jews to be involved in interfaith relations. Heshcel did attend the meeting and started to work with Bea and set down a kind of position paper as to what he would hope would come out of the Second Vatican Council's document. In church language, it's called schema, the document. Schema on the Jews. So for Heshcel, here's what the document, in his view, should include. It should include a denunciation of anti-Semitism as being a sin. This took until John Paul II declared anti-Semitism as a sin. It should include, most importantly, the rejection of the doctrine called mission to the Jews. In other words, the idea that Jews are only potential Christians, that Jews should be viewed as people who should become fulfilled through conversion to Christianity. Heshcel said, you can't have a dialogue between two people if one of them is trying to make the other one into something he's not. That's not a dialogue, that's a propagandizing. And that's an absolute prerequisite. Another prerequisite he set down was we will not engage in dialogue with Jewish apostates. In other words, we would be happy to talk with Christians who are Christians. We will not talk with Christians who were once Jews. And
Who's
this
we
was
here?
pardon me?
Who's the we here?
The Jews. He's setting down, his rules for interfaith dialogue. And this became a big sticking point. Because three of the people who were pushing this along in the church the most happen to have been former Jews. One was a leading American priest who was a German Jew who converted to Catholicism in the 30s, Monsignor John Ostreicher, who later was at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. In Canada, Father Gregory Baum in Toronto. I forgot who the third one was. But these were all Catholic priests who were once Jews. He wouldn't talk to them. Wouldn't even answer their letters. We'd get a letter in the office from one of them. I remember the first time a letter from Ostreicher came inviting him to Seton Hall. I said to Heshcel, how should I answer this letter? He said, you don't answer the letter.